Hey everyone, and welcome back. Now, today I wanted to talk about something that I think is really important within the crypto space, particularly if this is your first cycle or you're new. I think it's important for everybody, but I think generally I see this most, or I get questions from people who generally are somewhat new to the market. I think this is because probably a lot of us more experienced people have learned this the hard way. And so I wanted to create a quick video talking about knowing the bull and the bear case of something before you make an investment or put coins or do whatever within a particular asset. And so the reason why I want to talk about this is because I've seen a lot of people who will essentially say like, oh, this thing's going to 1000x guaranteed no matter what. And I understand having conviction. I understand like having a high degree of confidence that something's going to work out. Obviously, in order to do relatively well in a market like this, you do need to have that level of conviction. But there's a difference between conviction and delusion, right? And so that's what I want to talk about today and kind of discuss what that means and how we can kind of make sure that we're protecting ourselves against delusion masquerading as conviction, right? And so that's really kind of the big thing. How I want to get into this primarily is just kind of using a couple examples to hopefully like explain or convey how I think about this type of thing, and then hopefully it's useful for you. This is not financial advice. I'm not trying to give you any sort of advice for that matter. This is just purely my own opinion, and hopefully it will be helpful for you in kind of developing your own opinion, and you can kind of think about this and maybe even take a look at some of your own investments that you've made over the past weeks, months, years, whatever, and kind of take a look at it in this type of manner. So going into it, let's start with something I would say relatively basic. So let's look at Bitcoin, right? Here we can see Bitcoin, $97,000, almost $100,000. If we look, Bitcoin has been the best performing asset basically ever since it came out, right? Bitcoin has just been absolutely going nuts. I would say at this point, there's a massive, it's consensus essentially that like Bitcoin is money, like Bitcoin is a real legitimate asset. I think that's completely fair to say. However, when investing in Bitcoin, like there still is a bear case to Bitcoin, right? I think institutional investors or institutional commentators, things like that, up until probably relatively recently, have kind of always made the claim, well, the bear case for Bitcoin is and should be zero. Maybe that's not realistic anymore. I do think there's a world in which that could be, right? But I would say Bitcoin's probably about as safe as it can get. However, this is why I wanted to start using Bitcoin. But when looking at Bitcoin, there still is a bear case, right? And I can throw out a couple of them. What if there's a world war and money essentially tightens up and people are focused more on tangibles, food, ammo, clothes, shelter? Even if you want to go kind of a layer up from that, gold, silver, things like that are probably going to be more valuable than Bitcoin. And so if something like that were to happen, the price of Bitcoin would probably get trashed, and maybe it may not go to zero. It may come back, it may continue its run up to 1 million, but we may see a pretty insane move to the downside if we were to see something like that happen. Another potential cataclysmic event for Bitcoin is if it were to somehow, like if somebody were able to essentially crack the SHA-256 hashing method or the hashing algorithm, and like maybe quantum computing does this, right? And now the proof of work is no longer necessarily like truly proof of work. People can game the system and mess with the network and do things like that. The entire value of Bitcoin essentially at this point in time is built on the stability and the unhackability of the network. If that were to change, that completely changes the value proposition of Bitcoin, right? We can look into several other types of things within the crypto ecosystem. I actually have pulled up an article here that's just like the top 13 narratives for crypto, right? Going through, meme coins, prediction markets, liquid restaking tokens, liquid staking derivatives, all these type of things have stuff that you can invest in on this, right? Blockchain modularity, layer 1, Solana, Sui, layer 2s, Base, a whole bunch of different stuff in here. All of these people have invested in some way, right? And so if we go into something, let's say a little bit smaller, let's talk about Bitcoin. I've been in Bitcoin and like the ordinals, BRC20 runes ecosystem, basically ever since it came around. I've been in it for a substantial amount of time. I obviously have a high degree of conviction that this is going to be an investment that works out relatively well. My thinking is primarily it's Bitcoin. You've got alts. If you build alts on Bitcoin, why would that not do extremely well? Bitcoin's kind of the gold standard. And so if you were building what everybody else is building, but on the mother chain, it has to draw at least some sort of like attention and, positivity and hype and speculation, all this type of stuff, all of which usually follows gains. And so that's kind of my thesis for investing in all of this like ordinals ecosystem and whatnot, right? However, there is a very real possibility and a realistic possibility that it doesn't pan out. I would say most of the reason, I would guess at this point, if it doesn't pan out, a lot of this I would say primarily is due to tech restrictions or limitations. Obviously, Bitcoin is not a Turing complete language, and so there's a lot of it can't build smart contracts, right? And so there's a lot of people who are obviously trying to solve this solution, but currently there's no solution. And so like particularly with runes, it's essentially meme coins on Bitcoin, right? I think that's a massive market. We've seen what it's done on Solana. I think it can do similarly on Bitcoin. However, one of the big things that we've seen on Bitcoin, at least so far, is since it's not able to handle smart contracts, you can't really have dexes on chain because one, the chain's slow, and two, it can't handle smart contracts, right? So we can't really have liquidity pools. We can't have a lot of these things that really make trading really smooth on something like Solana. So that is a bear case. Obviously, I still believe that we're going to see maybe tech improvements or tech implementations or something that will kind of work around this. And obviously, when there's a lot of FUD around something and you're stepping into it, that's when you're likely going to get the best deal. But that's a very easy way to explain how that might not work out, right? There's other ones. If we look further on in this list, we can see real world assets being another. Bringing real world assets on chain, I think, is an amazing idea, but how does that look, right? I mean, Ondo is one that's been super popular. Well, a lot of these real world assets are already massively consolidated within banks, pension funds, BlackRock, these types of like wealth managers, money managers, that type of stuff. These are all companies that really have no incentive to give this up, right? And so if something were to come on chain, it would very likely be a private chain that these companies control because it makes a lot of sense. And particularly with a lot of the rules in the US regarding accredited investors specifically, but also just with like derivatives and fractional reserve banking, and a lot of this stuff doesn't play particularly well in an open ledger system when you can see some of the funny things that are happening. And also there's a lot more of like somewhat professional management that needs to be done over this type of stuff to make sure that your bank doesn't collapse or whatever, all that type of stuff. And so some of these things is like, yes, I think blockchain is definitely blockchain improves real world assets and it increases liquidity. It does a whole bunch of different types of stuff for real world assets. However, who's to say that Ondo is going to be that one that wins? I mean, BlackRock might just come on and say, hey, we're making BlackRock chain, and BlackRock chain is where all of the, all the like real world asset transacting is going to be done. I mean, they've got $10 trillion of assets. It would be really, really hard for Ondo to compete with that. Obviously, I know that there's a lot of like institutional money involved within Ondo, so maybe that's not necessarily a risk. But it's like, hopefully you guys can start to understand how we're going through and looking at these bear cases. If you're going in and looking at a coin and saying, I don't understand the bear case, well, there's either one of two things going on here. One, you're in a Ponzi scheme, or two, you haven't done enough homework, because you should always be able to identify a bear case when you're looking to make an investment. If you haven't, like I said, it's either a Ponzi and it's a scam, or you just haven't done enough research, and you should probably continue to do further research so you can understand the nuance well enough that you can essentially formulate why this would not succeed. And obviously you're hoping that it does, but you should always be able to understand, if my investment were to fail, why? And for me, like with all the investments that I make and all the things that I'm sitting in currently, I understand how it could fail and why it could fail. Now, obviously, I don't believe that's going to happen, but I feel like this also helps with conviction too, because if you understand the argument as to why your project might succeed or fail, it's going to help you hold when price drops 30% tomorrow. Because, if you don't really understand what you're holding or why, and price drops 30%, you might just sell because you really don't even know why you were there in the first place. Where if you actually understand what you're holding and you know why you're holding it and all that type of stuff, well, then when it drops 30%, you might be buying more, because while the price has gone down, if the fundamental assumption hasn't really changed and some of these bear cases that you've kind of foreseen and expected aren't really coming to pass, it's just like short-term insanity, well, then pick it up on a discount, right? And so that's kind of what I was trying to get at with this video, and hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully it was useful, giving you some things to kind of think about when trying to both vet projects, but also maybe reviewing some projects that you've already bought. Is make sure you understand how they could fail, because as long as you understand that, then you know when to buy, when to sell, when to double down, when to cut your losses, all that type of stuff. And hopefully, like, it'll make you a much better investor as we go on into the bull run, and potentially, when we start to get into the bear market. Because when we start to get into the bear market, that's when things get a little bit difficult in terms of understanding, okay, well, why is my coin dropping? Should I be getting rid of it? Is this only going to pull back 40 or 50% like BNB did, or is it going to pull back 99% like so many of these other projects did, or even go under completely, right? And so hopefully this was helpful. Like I said, if it was, please do give me a like and subscribe, because it really does help me out. Also, if you have any comments, questions, anything like that, please feel free to drop them in the comment section below. I do try to read and respond to all of my comments, so if you have anything you want me to see, that'd be a great way to do it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.